To thank you for inviting me to share with you my research in managing scales. This is a quick roadmap for my presentation. I'm going to start out with some biology on armored scales, discuss the species that are of concern for especially growing firs and spruce, go over some of the beneficial insects that feed on these scales, and then talk about practices that we may need to change in use of new alternative chemistries that should improve our ability to manage scales. Armored scales are really a unique group to talk about in terms of insect pests on landscape plants. They're in the order Hemiptera, which means that they have sucking mouthparts, but unlike other species of Hemiptera, they do not produce honeydew. They don't tap directly into the vascular system, xylem or phloem, of the plants to feed. They feed directly on plant cells within their hosts. The other thing that's unusual about them is that they secrete a scale cover that's not attached to their body. Unlike the soft or felt scales, in which the cover is part of their body, the scale cover is not part of the body for the armored scale. Another really weird thing about their biology is that the gut does not continuously go from the mouth parts to the anus. It simply dead ends somewhere in the insect, and the anus has additional functions for producing a cement that's used for making the cover and also for emitting sex-attractive pheromones. The males and females of armored scales look very different from each other. The crawler stage is an incredibly important part of the life cycle of these armored scales. It's the only stage that can move from where the sedentary female has been feeding to some new part of the plant or to some new plant. So on the right-hand side, you see an elongate hemlock scale that has been flipped over. So we're looking at the underside of the scale. And we can observe, first of all, the old shed skin from the second instar. And then we can see the female scale body through the scale covering here. And then a row of eggs, actually a double row. There's eggs on one side and on the other underneath the scale covering here. And there's a flap that will open up to allow the scale crawlers that have hatched a way to exit from underneath the mother scale's cover. One of the curious things about scale crawlers, and here we see a scale crawler with 2 eye spots, 2 antennae. You can't see the legs that are underneath. But on a conifer, all the scales that I've studied will actually slit the cuticle of the needle and will slide themselves underneath. So to some extent, they're feeding within the plant itself. But the important thing is that they are the only stage that can disperse. So they can crawl to a new area on the plant, they can blow about in the wind, almost like pollen, or they can be hitchhiking on other insects or perhaps on birds. This diagram shows the life cycle of the armored scale, starting out from the crawler stage, or first instar nymph. They would settle on the plant, start to feed. After they have fed for a while, they'll molt into the second instar nymph. And from that point, they either develop into a female or a male. If they develop into the female, they will molt one more time and continue to feed. And of course, grow after that last molt into the stage that would be mating and then producing eggs. If they develop into a male, the molt from the second instar nymph does not have functional mouthparts, and so this stage is called a prepupa, or third instar, which then will molt yet once again to form the pupa, or the fourth instar, and then finally emerge as the adult male. So this life cycle on this side of the figure is rather like what we see in thrips. Here's an example of an adult male and a female for which I have removed the scale cover so you can see her. You may remember in introductory entomology that insects have three body parts: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. But when it comes to scales, that's not so clear. Basically, the head, thorax, and abdomen are all fused into one amorphous mass. And so in this illustration, you see the upper half and the lower half of the body. You have to imagine this part being reflected over to this side to show the complete view of the upper surface of the body. And it shows you that there's not a whole lot to look at in terms of external morphology of a scale insect. There's a very tiny eye, very tiny antenna, and then there's this part of the body called the pygidium, which contains the really important parts, the anal opening and the vulva. This is a picture of a female scale. And the pygidium is important because from these various glands is secreted wax, which is mixed with the cement through the anal opening, and then shaped like by these parts, which act like little trowels to shape the scale covering. So the scale is moving about underneath the scale cover and using this structure, the pygidium, at the hind end of its body to form the scale cover around it. The male scale is really distinctive. It does not have functioning mouth parts. It has 4 compound eyes. You can see the 2 eyes on one side here. Very long antennae, which are used to detect sex pheromone produced by a female scale. 1 pair of wings, and most importantly for it, it has its external genitalia, which are used to reach underneath the flap where the crawlers would emerge for a female scale. It reaches underneath that flap to be able to inseminate the female scale. A very important part of their biology is that the male scales are haploid. They have only 1 set of chromosomes, whereas the females are diploid. That means that the female is able to determine the sex of her offspring by whether she fertilizes the egg or not. There are 2 large groups within the armored scales represented on this slide. There's the elongate forms of scales, Diospidine group, which has the old scale covers from previous nymphs held at one side of the body. And then there are the Aspidiotine subfamily of scales that are circular in shape, in which the old scale covers are present in the center of the scale body. Of course, the reason why we are interested in studying the biology of armored scales is because they damage the plants on which they feed. Many of the plants that we find feeding in the landscape are doubly damaging because not only may the scales feed on the foliage, but they may also feed on the stems of the plants. As the scales are feeding, they're inserting their mouth parts to feed directly on parenchyma cells, and they're killing those cells as they're feeding, possibly both by directly removing the cell contents and also by injecting the toxic saliva back into the plant. Thankfully for the conifers, well, I don't know if we can say that we can be thankful for this, the scales only feed on the needles, but as they're feeding on the needles, they're causing these same sort of toxic reactions from when they are injecting their saliva back into the foliage that they've been feeding on. with the resulting chlorosis or necrosis, and those damaged needles may then shed from the tree. This is the elongate hemlock scale, Phytotoxicity externa, which is native to Asia. It was brought into the United States accidentally sometime around 1908. It was discovered in New York State. The thing I'd like to point out, we've already looked at this slide quite a bit, but there's one thing that I did not mention to you previously, and that is this is an unusual characteristic for the Phytotoxicity genus. They have a membrane that covers the underside of the scale. The scale is flipped over, so there's both a scale cover over the top of the scale, which we see here, the female scale, the upper view, and also a membrane that covers underneath her, between her and the plant. You can see this thread-like shining bit here, and those are her mouth parts, which were pulled out from the plant. On the left side, you can see male scales developing, as well as this collar inserting itself under the cuticle of the needle. There are 1 or 2 generations per year of elongate hemlock scale. They feed on a number of other genera of plants other than true firs. Of course, they're called hemlock scales, so they feed on tsuga, which are the hemlocks. But they can be found on, to some degree, on spruce as well. So there are 2 other conifer plant families that can be hosts for this species. One of the important aspects of the elongate hemlock scale male biology is that they produce a lot of woolly wax material. People sometimes mistake their feeding activity for the presence of adelgids on the infested trees. Normally, as they are producing this woolly material and the plant is growing outside, the wind will disturb the branches and that waxy material will get rubbed off onto surrounding foliage, making the foliage look rather dirty, if you will. But when a tree is harvested and cut and brought into a customer's home, the wind isn't blowing those branches around, and the wax can be extruded and it just continues being produced, so you can have filaments that are really extraordinarily long when you consider how small the scale is. This is an image taken from a tree. You can see the wires for the Christmas tree lights here. This tree may have been inside a person's house for a couple months for the wax to have developed this much. The nice thing about knowing this is that if you want to know how well your management program is working for managing armored scales, you can purposely cut some branches, stick them into water, and then bring them inside during the winter to observe whether the male scales are alive or dead. If they're alive, they'll resume development and produce this kind of woolly material. Somehow I don't think that we're going to be able to have our customers pay a little extra for this natural flocking. The Kryptomeria scale is one of these circular sorts of scales. It's has a very translucent scale cover. You can see the yellow nipple, or the old scale cover, right in the center of the scale. And you can look right through the scale cover to see the female scale underneath. We have a lot of problems with this scale in Christmas tree plantations or landscape plantings of true firs. The populations can build up very rapidly to the point where there's essentially standing room only populations of scales on the undersides of the needles. Now, it's been said that nature abhors a vacuum, and when you have large populations of insects feeding on plants, there ought to at least be something feeding on them, and there oftentimes is. So there are many specialized predators, parasites, and diseases of armored scales that would normally naturally keep them in balance in the environment. The first I'll mention is the twice-stabbed lady beetle, or Chilocaris species. They're very distinctive in being good-sized, fairly large lady beetles, black with 2 red spots on their back, and both the adults and their larvae feed exclusively on armored scales. This is a very small predatory beetle that feeds exclusively on armored scales. It was brought in by a researcher from University of Massachusetts for control of euonymus scale, but it will feed generally on practically any armored scale. Cybersyphilis Nipponicus originated from Korea. Both the adult female and male, and also the larva, will feed on scales. The larva is hard to observe in the field as it's a very tiny insect and tends to feed underneath the scale covers, which provides it some protection. It's fairly easy to find evidence of these various scale predators if they're present. Here is an example of where there has been no predation on Kryptomeria scale. And you can look at this image and you can see that almost all the scales have been fed upon by predators. And the reason why I can say that is because the scales are actually feeding underneath the waxy cuticle of the conifer needle. Every time a predator has eaten one, it leaves behind this track of where the wax has been disturbed from where the scale used to have been. There are many species of parasitic wasps will attack armored scales. The adult wasp here, Encarsia citrina, will come along and lay its egg into a second instar female scale, and she'll sting that scale insect and deposit an egg, and then that egg will hatch into a larva that consumes the scale underneath that scale cover. And then when the wasp has completed development, the newly emerging adult wasp will cut a circular hole, a very distinctive circular hole, to emerge. This is a different species of parasitic wasp I've only seen on a few occasions, but where it has been present, it's been present in great abundance. This is closely related to the golden cowlsid, which is used commercially for control of California red scale in citrus. Fungi get into the act too. Here I show 3 different fungi I've worked with that cause infections in armored scales. If we have so many of these generalist scale predators available, and diseases and parasitoids, then there has to be an explanation for why we have scale outbreaks. And much of the explanation has to do with the ecology of the predators versus the scales, and these are various possible explanations that people have arrived at. There could be a poor synchrony or timing of the development of the predator might not match the scale life cycle. There could be a disturbance in nutritional balance when we feed excessive nitrogen to the trees and shrubs. Plant stress can weaken the defenses of plants. For example, trees in an urban environment are much more likely to have scale populations than a similar tree that would be out in the forest. There may be a lack of a specialist natural enemy that would be present in the homeland for some exotic species of scale. And I think one of the most important could be the lack of resources that natural enemies need. For example, nectar or pollen in the environment that they might be feeding upon. So if they're not being held in check by natural mechanisms, it falls back on us to try to use chemical control, some sort of an insecticide to keep their numbers in check. And the basic strategies that have been used have been to suffocate the scales with a dormant oil spray, to use a contact insecticide to kill the crawlers when they're moving about on the plant surfaces, and that could also include horticultural oil. And lastly, because these insects are feeding on the plant with sucking mouth parts, there's a lot of interest in using systemic insecticides to reach them from the inside of the plant. It used to be, when I was working with scales and tree fruits, I would think of horticultural oil as the go-to material for managing scales. But there are a lot of reasons why horticultural oil performance is kind of lackluster for managing armored scales. To start out with, if you're talking about Christmas trees, the problem of spray coverage is really quite acute. We have been growing trees to have really dense foliage. We have multiple layers of branches, and the scales are feeding on the undersides of the needles, so that makes it practically impossible to get the kind of absolutely complete spray coverage with horticultural oil that would be essential to suffocate the scales. The second problem with horticultural oil is the potential to cause phytotoxicity. Now, this is certainly most of a problem with a species like Douglas fir, which if you spray them at any time with horticultural oil, the tree will turn an off yellow color. But even with an overall oil compatible species like Fraser fir, as you see in this species, the buds were just breaking at the time that the horticultural oil was being applied, and that left a yellow tip of the needle when those needles expanded further. The real challenge is contacting the scale under the scale cover with the oil. Not only is there scale cover, but on Christmas trees, these scales are inserting themselves under the waxy cuticle of the needle. There can be a thick scale cover, and the scale body isn't connected to the scale cover, so you're not going to get direct connection or contact of the oil with the body of the scale. And also, there's this little pocket of air underneath the scale cover that might serve as a reserve air supply. So if we're trying to suffocate the scales, it might be really hard to accomplish that. And then when we're talking about Kryptomeria scale, there can be offspring of crawlers that hatch underneath the mother scale's cover that never leave from underneath her cover, and they simply settle right there and start to feed. So that there can be multiple layers of scales that are developing, and it would be hard to get horticultural oil to penetrate through all those additional covers. Another thing to consider, it's not really phytotoxicity, but certain species of trees that have a waxy bloom on the needle, like Colorado blue spruce, will simply turn dark green when you contact that waxy material on the needles with the horticultural oil. So instead of being a blue spruce, it would be a dark green spruce. On the other hand, horticultural oil has some really great benefits for scale management. For one thing, since it has no residual toxicity, once you have sprayed the oil, the only natural enemies that you're going to be hurting are those that were killed at the time of spraying. And so once the spray is done, those natural enemies will have a chance to move about on the plant surface and do their job for you. This additional consideration is that there's unlikely to be variation in susceptibility to suffocation. And so scales should not be able to evolve resistance, This is somewhat controversial. Maybe they could evolve thicker scale covers. But in any case, I'm not sure that there's ever been any case of insecticide resistance to horticultural oil among insects. Crawler sprays are one of the principal ways in which we can manage armored scales. Recognizing that they might be difficult to kill from underneath the scale cover when they have a cover, the crawler is really the only stage that's not protected by this cover. Furthermore, most of the scale crawlers will come out from underneath the mother scale's cover and will be crawling about on the plant surfaces. So if we have a residual insecticide, contact insecticide, then the scale crawlers will dose themselves as they're moving about on the plant. If you need to time the spray for targeting scale crawlers, then one useful tool is to set up crawler traps. And I use black electrical tape wrapped first so that the sticky side is inside, so it sticks to the branch. Then double it back and wrap it very tightly so that the sticky side is then facing out, and leave a little handle where you can then unwrap the crawler trap later. Remember to leave some colored flagging on the branch so you can find that crawler trap when you come back to visit it. One way to make the trap work a little bit longer is to use some Vaseline to coat the surface, and then the crawlers will be stuck onto the trap. You unwrap the crawler trap to observe the contrasting color of the tiny little crawlers that might have gotten stuck onto that surface. Another way that you can time a crawler spray is by physically observing when the adult scales are producing eggs, and to watch very carefully for the development of eggs to suggest when those eggs are going to be hatching. This can be done either with a hand loop, a very traditional approach, or now there's very inexpensively available USB microscopes they're portable. You can take them right out to the field. And I think that another advantage of these is that you can take pictures of what you're looking at and also share those images with experts to get their advice. One of the challenges with the old-fashioned insecticides that were used to target crawlers are that they're broad spectrum and long residual products. Some examples of this would be bifenthrin or other pyrethroids, carbaryl or 7, and certain of the neonicotinoids, but not imidacloprid, which really does not have good activity against this family of scales. The problem with this class of insecticides is that they're very potent against the natural enemies of the same scales you're trying to control. So what happens is chemical exclusion of the natural enemies and then eventual pest resurgence. The same pest that you're trying to control, the armored scales, ends up building up to even higher populations than if you had never sprayed. And so the message here is that without having a systemic activity, you're never going to be able to contact those scales that settle under the mother scale's cover. And so going in with a purely contact-acting material to target scale crawlers is never going to be completely satisfactory. The sheer population size of some of these scale insects can be a grave concern, because when we try to control them with chemical insecticides, I think it's kind of foolhardy. Their numbers are so large that it practically guarantees that there will be individuals in the population that will carry genes that will allow them to survive, especially considering that the males are haploid, which means that every trait is expressed as a dominant trait. There's nothing hidden by recessive traits in the males. And so that's a very efficient way for scales to be able to adapt quickly to the environment, including the use of various insecticides. The opportunity to use systemic insecticides to control scales is really quite remarkable. If you look at the list that I've provided to you, we have 5 truly systemic insecticides that can be presented through the vascular system, move throughout the plant, and be presented to the scale as it feeds on the plant tissues. And then there's one translaminar insecticide that's absorbed through the foliage that could also be useful. And this is talking about 6 different modes of action available to us to target control of armored scales. I've demonstrated through my research that dinotefuran can be very effective when applied just sprayed on the bark of the tree at the base of the trunk to control armored scales in Christmas tree plantations, with the dose required to control the scales proportional to the size of the tree. I'm not going to belabor that work because it's something that I've spoken about with your group previously. But I would say if you want to learn more about it, that's easy to do. I have published 3 videos, educational videos, which you can find at my website at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. If you search for my name and then find my page and go to the bottom of the page, you will find these 3 videos available to you. There are a number of problems, though, in relying upon insecticides like dinotefuran to control armored scales. And I have listed those problems here. Foremost, our concern being toxicity to pollinators, but also, of course, toxicity of those insecticides to natural enemies of scales. The neonicotinoids that might be considered for managing armored scales are the ones listed in red here. That's dinotefuran, clothianidin, and thiamethoxam. Those happen to be nitroguanidine neonicotinoids, which are extremely highly toxic to honeybees. In work that I've done with cooperators here at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, we have investigated the movement of systemic insecticides into pollen collected by honeybees that were stationed at nurseries. We sorted out those pollens by their color and then analyzed them in the laboratory to determine which species of plants were presenting the greatest risk of exposure. And the bottom line here is that spirea and probably any other rosaceous plant will readily transport neonicotinoids into nectar and pollen. The neonicotinoids applied to woody plants can be held over for more than 1 year as well. Now, of course, talking to Christmas tree growers, you would say that the Christmas trees themselves aren't going to be producing nectar. However, we oftentimes do have flowering plants that are growing right in the vicinity of our Christmas trees. And if we're doing a full foliar spray to try to target crawlers and to control armored scales that may have already settled on the trees, then we do have to be concerned about flowering plants in the vicinity because the spray drift is going to be contaminating those other plants. So there are only a couple strategies available to us to try to avoid problems, one of which is to mow the plants or eliminate flowering plants that are blooming near the trees, or to choose insecticides that have lower inherent toxicity to the pollinators. In my opinion, it would be a much better strategy to find insecticides that have lower toxicity to pollinators, because the flowering plants probably have important ecological value in terms of supporting our natural enemies for various pests, not just armored scales. Having these concerns in mind, has guided my research efforts to try to find alternatives to dinotefuran for control of armored scales. So I conducted a spray trial this past year with foliar sprays to intercept elongate hemlock scale crawlers in a Christmas tree plantation. Christmas trees make a really great experimental laboratory, if you will, because it's so nicely replicated. There are Christmas trees that were naturally infested with elongate hemlock scale. I sprayed 70 gallons per acre with a backpack mist blower. And the thing to keep in mind here is that I applied 2 sprays to intercept the crawlers, June 27th and again on July 7th. These are the results from that test, in which I have conveniently grouped the results into 3 bunches of treatments. Here I have one group that was completely ineffective. They're not statistically significantly different from the water check. There's one product that has relatively low activity, and the remaining materials have good insecticidal activity. There's some curious things about these results, though, that I'd like to share with you. One of which is that the systemic insecticide ARIA, flonikamid, has a very, very similar mode of action to the product here, Ventigra, which is a phytopyropin. Both of them act upon the same mechanism of affecting the proprioceptor used by the insect to know whether it has just contracted or relaxed its muscles involved with feeding. So that's that was a really surprising result for me to see that. The other thing that, a couple other things that surprised me is that azadirachtin had virtually no effect. That would have been an organically acceptable, somewhat systemic material that has insect growth regulator properties as well as anti-feedant properties. I have been hoping for it to be effective. And the other one is mainspring, which is cyantraniliprole, that is in the anthranilic diamide class of insecticides and is a new group of systemic products for which obviously there's some hope that it would have been effective against armored scales. So the bottom line is for ARIA, mainspring, and azadirachtin, there's no evidence from this trial that they had any significant activity against armored scales. Movento is a curious product in that it is systemic and it's mobile in the plant both upward and downward, and it interferes with the production of fatty acids and waxes by the insect. I think that this is an insecticide that will be well worth looking at further in the future because it has low toxicity to natural enemies and to pollinators. I've mentioned the mode of action to you already for Ventigra. That is statistically equivalent to the chemical control standard Safari, as well as the insect growth regulator product that is only translaminar in its systemic activity. That is pyriproxyfen or Distance. The truly outstanding material in this trial was Tristar, which is acetamiprid, which is, although being a neonicotinoid insecticide, it's not in the same class as Safari and is about 1,000 to 2,000 times less toxic to honeybees than Safari. So insecticides that you might want to consider would be Tristar, which is a neonicotinoid but has lower toxicity to bees. Distance, or pyriproxyfen, which is an insect growth regulator, which has a long history of being shown to be IPM friendly, having relatively little impact on the biology of the various predators and parasites that are feeding on the armored scales. And then Ventigra, or phytopyropin, is another product that is IPM friendly that ought to be considered. So Distance and Vintegra should be considered alternatives to any of the neonicotinoid products for managing scales through use of these insecticides as crawler sprays. An outstanding and unanswered question that I'll have to deal with in my future research is to find out whether one spray will work for managing these armored scales. I know that it's very expensive to be going out and spraying a plant in the first place, and so if we can make one spray work as well as two sprays, then that will save a lot of effort. I think that one thing I'll be trying this year will be a combination of horticultural oil with some of the materials that were alternatives to the dinotefuran. So Movento, Vintegra, and Distance all are candidates for combining with horticultural oil and to time the spray when there's peak crawler hatch. The reason to combine oil with these other materials, the oil is a really good tool to use for insecticide resistance management, as well as having a very low impact on the natural enemies. And then combining it with any one of these three products that have some degree of systemic activity should mean that there should be a really good combination effect. And I'd like to caution that the target for managing scales probably should be for selective suppression of the scale populations, meaning that we're killing scales rather than the natural enemies. And if we're able to accomplish this with a selective insecticide, then we don't need to eliminate 100% of the scale population. And that over time, we'll be able to tell how well one of these insecticide programs is working and how sustainable it is, because if we follow that kind of a spray program for a few years and look at how the scale population responds over time, if the population disappears and the problem has resolved itself, then we know that we found a sustainable insecticide program. If, on the other hand, if we continue to use this kind of a management program and the scale populations increase over a few years, then that's an indication that we haven't found a truly selective insecticide to work in an IPM mode. The really important tool available to us to understand whether our pest management program is working well is to compare the populations of scales on our Christmas trees that we are managing with the armored scales on neighboring hemlocks or abandoned Christmas trees nearby. That can tell us whether our insecticide program or pest management program overall is working or not. And this is the reason why I know that there is a real problem with relying upon Safari as a foliar spray to manage armored scales. On this particular farm, I can go and look through these trees and find incredibly high populations of Kryptomeria Scale in little patches here and in some trees over here. And there are some abandoned Christmas trees in this location and hemlock trees alongside the edge of this roadway that have hardly any scale populations. So what it tells me is that the spray practices and fertilizer program and vegetation management program within these Christmas tree plantings have somehow prevented the biological control from being effective at keeping the scales at low populations, whereas the biological control has been effective here and over here. Overall, I think we really need to rethink the entire strategy for management of armored scales and start right from the basics with the landscape design and how we're planting our Christmas trees to consider what the predators need first and try to have that provided to them so that we can have more effective use of natural enemies and biological control. Another aspect of the landscape design is to somehow try to reduce the stress to our trees. It's certainly true that trees in an urban landscape are really severely affected by nearby presence of hardscape or paved areas. And similarly, I think that where we have Christmas trees and unhealthy soil situations brought about by our herbicide strips and perhaps a lack of irrigation during times of drought, that we might be able to change the situations perhaps by providing a wood chip mulch instead of a herbicide strip within the rows, that would reduce the stress and make it less likely for armored scales to gain the upper hand. We need to look into the possibility of releasing armored scale parasitoids in place of using insecticides to manage the scales. And our target should be to only use selective insecticides, and very infrequently at that, to try to do a slight adjustment in the system to keep the scales from becoming problematic. Are there any questions for me?